Red Alert 2 is possibly the best RTS of all time, but for none of the reasons you usually attribute to RTS. But before we get ahead of ourselves, what is Red Alert 2? When I think back to the release date in October of 2000, I was drawing penny farthings with missile launchers strapped to the handlebars in my science notebook when I should have been paying attention. So yeah, Red Alert 2 really clicked with me hard. Like, I think I actually lost a friend because I wouldn't shut up about it. In short, this is a real-time strategy where you build bases, collect and manage resources, and then build an army to crush your opponent, all while looking down from the skies. In the campaign, you're either going to side with the Allied forces or the Soviets. So which do you pick? You pick the Soviets because they have freaking apocalypse tanks and mind-controlled giant squids. But a case could be made for the Allied forces because Tanya's hot, so I don't know. It's your life. Anyways, we'll come back to the story. I'm going to be making a lot of references back to Command & Conquer Tiberian Sun, which was Westwood Studios' prior release in 1999. I did a review on Tiberian Sun in 2023, and I recommend checking it out because it will give the comparisons a little bit of context. The Command & Conquer Tiberium series generally shows a modicum of restraint, like an older brother with extra responsibilities. The Red Alert series, on the other hand, serve as a prequel that spins off into an alternate universe and is very much the younger child that mom and dad just let run around and do whatever they want. So what are things like in this alternate history? Well, Albert Einstein invents time travel after World War II, goes back in time and removes a certain mustached man from existence. But the result is that Joseph Stalin pretty much starts World War II just later in time, and that's the setting for Red Alert. Red Alert 2 is a reignition of this war between the Allies and the Soviets when Russia's Premier Romanov decides he's done with being puppet leadership. Or is he? Anyways, Red Alert takes place in Europe, and Red Alert 2 starts with a massive invasion onto US soil. You already know this because only a psychopath would skip the intro. I mean, it's freaking Hell March. The first thing you're going to notice is that Red Alert 2 is visually worlds apart from Tiberian Sun, and really, it's a departure for the series as a whole. Tiberian Sun was somber, used contrast sparingly, and they made an effort to try and maintain a believable scale. Red Alert 2 just says, that's cool, but how about a lot of color? Red Alert 2 is bright, contrasty, and the scale is sacrificed for a greater level of detail. Overall, it gives Red Alert 2 a whimsical, cartoony quality that feels upbeat. Like, I think you could use these graphics in a roller coaster tycoon game just fine. This is an America that is still alive, and sure, you might be killing it or saving it, but there's still a lot going on. What adds to this feeling is that a lot of the levels are urban. There are roads, buildings, and people walking around going about their life. Later, you will play in levels in more rural areas, but even there, the farms have cows, there's alligators in Florida, so yeah, in comparison to a lot of RTS games, Red Alert 2 is just bustling with life. Not to mention that you get to do a bit of sightseeing. The Statue of Liberty, the Kremlin, the Pentagon, and the White House all feature in it, which is nice because now I can say I've been there. I just want to take a moment here to appreciate how well this game is aged. Like, yeah, it can be a pain with compatibility settings and whatnot. I'll put a link to the setup instructions in the description, but that aside, I actually think that the 2D graphics have held up remarkably well. Dare I say, I think this is the best looking Command & Conquer game to date. At the time, I thought that 3D was the future, and there's no doubt that you can do it, but I often look back and kind of wish they stuck with 2D. They really hit on an art style that seems timeless, and I think that really helped. But also, I think these explosions are some of my favorite in any RTS. I mean, look at the V3 rockets. There's something about how the fumes trail from the rocket that is both simple and mesmerizing. I can't stop looking at it. Okay, cool world setting and interesting premise, but what's the gameplay like? Well, as I mentioned before, you command your base and army from above. No matter what faction you're playing, you need a construction yard to build buildings, barracks to produce troops, a war factory for vehicles, and then you have various tech structures that you can build to unlock your special units and abilities. You need power plants to keep all of this stuff running as well. Each faction, of course, also has a refinery. You earn money by using harvesters to collect ore and then deliver it to the refinery to collect those doubloons. Unlike many RTSs, there are no builder units. You just queue an item and it sucks the cash out of your bank account, and once it's ready, you place it. Where the Red Alert series deviates from the standard in RTS is that you have naval units and you need a naval construction yard to build those. It's interesting that Red Alert had wild power differences in balance. The Allies kind of owned the sea and the Soviets generally dominated on the land, but this was also held in check by the Allies having cheaper, faster land units, and the Soviet submarines couldn't really be seen, so they generally got the first volley. Red Alert 2 sort of has this balance philosophy, but it's a bit flatter. The Soviets still have the strongest tanks and the best artillery and V3 rockets, but the Allies also have access to some high-tech weaponry that can be used to invalidate this raw power if it's used right. On the seas, the Allied forces have more options, but again, the Soviets generally get the element of surprise with submarines and giant squids. These aren't hard and strict rules for how the game plays out, just the feeling I got playing it. Don't get mad at me if you get stomped by an Allied tank line, like it happens. I'll take a moment here to express that the controls for Red Alert 2 are kind of the turning point where they are modern enough that you don't feel handicapped. As someone playing these games in 2023, it can be somewhat frustrating to have things that we've become accustomed to, but Red Alert 2 has most of these features. Have you ever noticed that if you're watching a StarCraft 2 Pro, they're just all over the map, flicking between different views? Well, that's because if you double press on a control group, the camera centers on that group. This is in Red Alert 2, and it's a game changer. Most things here work well, and I will say that the unit pathing can sometimes mess you up. It's better than Tiberian Sun, but your units might just decide to drive through the enemy base, even though if you click a couple pixels to the left, it'll send them on the safe path. There's also a bit of stubbornness in unit movement. Like, Grizzly tanks love to get as close as possible to a target, even though it will kill them if it blows up. And sometimes units overshoot where they're told to go and kind of creep into enemy defenses. So yeah, there are moments where it feels like failing wasn't really your fault, but it's more of a rare occurrence here. I don't think anyone playing this game in 2023 can really feel hard done by because of it. Now, even though all the basic building structures are consistent between factions, they are wildly different in theme. This was the first time Westwood had really done this. If you look back to Tiberian Sun, construction yards, for example, were identical across factions and you relied on the coloring to distinguish them. Red Alert 2 is the first time in the whole Command & Conquer series where everything, even down to the basic infantry, is different from faction to faction. It's not just skin deep. For example, the Allied soldiers are called GIs, and GIs are weaker than Soviet soldiers, but if you deploy them, they'll build a sandbag wall and mount a machine gun, making them stronger and tougher than the cheaper Soviet conscripts. You could argue that they gave both factions attack dogs, but they still tried to distinguish them by giving the Soviets Huskies and the Allies Alsatians. I mean, even the Harvesters. The Harvesters are different. The Allied Harvester can use chrono technology to teleport back to the refinery after collecting ore, while the Soviet Harvester is armored and has a machine gun turret. So yeah, Soviet Harvester rush meta incoming. Only took 20 years. Now, one of the things I praised Tiberian Sun for was the little details. Red Alert 2 has these little details like crane cables swinging in the wind, fuel barrels billowing into the air when they explode. And yeah, I mean, you can see Tanya throw two 9mm pistols in the air and catch them. But what really impresses me is that Red Alert 2 is just crazy with how many neat interactions there are. The Allied IFV is a fast attack vehicle with a missile launcher on top, but the turret changes depending on what infantry you put in it. Put an engineer in it and it becomes a repair truck. Place a GI in it and it gets a machine gun turret. Heck, it even interacts with Soviet units. Let's say you use a Psi Commando to mind control the IFV. Yeah, mind control's a thing in this game. And you then put another Psi Commando in the IFV. The IFV will get a Psi Blast turret that does AoE damage. Naturally, the Soviets have Tesla coils for base defenses. However, you can overcharge Tesla coils and improve their range and damage by leaving a Tesla trooper near it. Oh yeah, this one level, you use a bunch of Tesla troopers to turn the Eiffel Tower into a giant Tesla coil. The imagination in Red Alert 2 just puts a smile on my face. Almost every building can be garrisoned by regular troops, making them great defensive points. Mind-controlled giant squids will disable ships and slowly sink them, but Navy-trained dolphins can fire out an echo that will stun the squid and make them let go of the ship. Anti-air units can shoot down V3 rockets before they decimate your base, but terror drones infect vehicles and slowly rip them apart from the inside. Or how about this? Mind control the cow with the Psy Commando, attach a bomb to the cow using Crazy Ivan, and then walk the cow into the enemy base. It's just delightful. Experienced units gain promotions and then become absolutely monstrous. I mean, the best example I have is the Kirov airship. Once these are fully promoted, they no longer drop normal bombs, but Tesla bombs that spark in a wide AoE. I mean, try and kill a platoon of battle-hardened Apocalypse tanks. The difference is night and day, and it really gives you this incentive to look after your units. So yeah, the one thing they ditched from Tiberian Sun was ground deformation. You can still blow up bridges, but I guess they didn't like the idea of making the ground permanently unusable after using something like a nuke. But other than that, they really just went nuts with it. There's tons, and I'm sure I'm missing some, and I'd love to hear your favorite combos in the comments below. Circling back to the faction's visuals, the Soviets sport rugged and boxy designs for their tanks and buildings, almost like they're still operating on World War II principles. Like the Soviet basic tank is the Rhino and the Allied basic tank is the Grizzly. And if you ever wondered what a fight between a Rhino and a bear looks like, we can settle it right here. The Rhino just flattens the Grizzly like it's nothing. Buildings here are very traditionally Russian, often having those onion bulb designs on top of them. Another example is that the barracks has a statue of a Russian soldier on top. Everything about the Soviets is about raw power through might and metal. The Allies, on the other hand, sport more futuristic designs that appear smoother and more cylindrical, especially the buildings. Their vehicles tend towards being more high-tech and more application-specific. Mirage tanks disguise themselves as trees, making them perfect for an ambush, but they can die pretty quickly if you're not paying attention. It would go amiss not to mention the prism technology. Since the Soviets get to harness the power of electricity, the Allies employ Albert Einstein's help to develop defensive towers and tanks that basically magnify light into a point as a weapon. What's cool about this is that if you have a bunch of prism tanks, they will refract off of each other and combine their damage in a big AoE. If you see a prism tank death herd moving your way, forget about it. They basically just one-shot everything that isn't in the air. Now would be a good time to mention special technology abilities. The Soviets get access to the trusty nuclear missile and a device called the Iron Curtain that can make your units invincible for a period of time. Very annoying on terror drones. The Allies get weather control, which basically just forms a big lightning storm over a targeted area. In addition, the trusty Chronosphere can teleport some vehicles from one place to another. Ever just wanted 5 tanks appear in the middle of your base? Well, that can happen, and it has happened to me. I didn't like it. Anyways, I could go on forever about different units. There's a ton of cool stuff. If you play the multiplayer or skirmish, you can pick a country of origin, and then you get access to that country's specific unit. For example, Iraq gives you Desolators, which are troops that shoot out radioactive goo, and then they can also deploy and poison the ground. Or you can play as France, and then you get the Grand Cannon, which if you feel like recreating the Maginot Line, then yeah, you can do that. See, there I go again. Okay, we're moving on. So obviously, if you play the Allied campaign, you are fighting the Soviet invasion, and from there you take the fight abroad. I'd say that the Allied campaign is the easiest to start off with, since a lot of the missions are just you controlling Tanya, who is hot. But also she kills infantry instantly, and she can blow up buildings and ships with C4 while shouting, "Take it, baby!" The other reason is that the Allied missions tend to have more tutorial content that teach you the basics as you play. That's not to say that the Allied missions are easy, they just ease you into things a bit better. The Soviet campaign does have some tutorial content, but for the most part it's, here's a new thing, go do the thing. And the thing is mostly crushing the US. The hammy live-action cutscenes are here, and it's easy to argue that it's even better suited to Red Alert's tongue-in-cheek approach rather than Command & Conquer's cold dystopia. So Tiberian Sun had us playing as named generals, and you got to see the commander that you were playing as, so you had a ringside seat to the drama and the rivalry unfolding. Now the pro is that it makes the story deeply personal, and the con is that it might be harder to self-insert. I sit more in favor of the personal story, so I liked this approach, approach, and not having it in Red Alert 2 exposes a kind of detachment. Nothing that is going on really affects you. Like, Anton Slavik is literally on death row in the opening of Tiberian Sun. Nothing like that happens here, and there is no real danger to you, if that makes sense. Furthermore, the two campaigns are completely detached without any acknowledgement of the events that happen from one to the other. I'm getting into light spoilers here, so you have been warned. The Soviet campaign is just far more interesting plot-wise. So Premier Romanov is using a psychic named Yuri to aid in the invasion of the US, brainwash the citizens, etc. I mean, he was instrumental in stopping the US from retaliating with nuclear weapons when the invasion began. It's in the intro. Unfortunately, partway into the story, it starts to become obvious from Romanov's behavior that Yuri has slithered into the mind of Romanov, and infighting ensues. The Allied campaign just has you straight up talking to and agreeing with everything your superiors say, whether that be General Karvel, the president, or your interactions with Tanya. But the point is that the Allied campaign just doesn't acknowledge the result of the infighting in the Soviet campaign. In fact, Yuri is just absent aside from a mention here or there in the Allied campaign. Tanya is played by Carrie Werrer, I don't know how to pronounce her name, who was in movies like Anaconda and Eight-Legged Freaks. And yeah, I know those aren't like Oscar-worthy, but I think she had the talent to pull it off, but I don't think she was given the right script. Don't get me wrong, I'm well aware that this is all campy cheese, but the US president, I get it. Karvel, I get it. Yuri, I get it. Tanya in-game is a badass that shouts things like cha-ching, shake it baby, and then laughs like a maniac while doming Soviets like she's never done anything else and never wants to do anything else. But in the cutscenes, she's just kind of annoyed. Both versions have a lot of attitude, but it's just the wrong attitude on display. I feel like I'm getting reprimanded for forgetting the almond milk in her chai latte or something. Now, while the Tanya in Red Alert 2 is arguably the most attractive, there's just not a lot going on in the cinematics. Like, she's always looking at a map or leaning over a desk or rummaging through supplies. I mean, remember the interrogation scene with Tanya in Red Alert? She doesn't say a word, but perfectly captures the character and the stakes in under a minute. Like the old saying goes, actions speak louder than words, and Tanya is a character that is supposed to champion the doing of heroism. She wouldn't complain about a situation, she would just ignore your orders and do what she thinks is right. Anyways, Tanya does warm up to you by the end, but it definitely feels contrived because it's contrived. The Allied ending is also a little bit of a WTF moment that only made sense in the early 2000s, but I won't spoil it. Check it out for yourself. What I'm trying to say here is that I like the live action cutscenes, and a lot of them play into the gag of the hyper US and Soviet culture to the point of satire. I'm not going to say that it lacks passion, but rather it could have used a little bit of focus and direction. So yeah, in comparison to Tiberian Sun, I'd say that the story is a bit of a step backwards. It's more detached, there are more forced moments, and the two stories don't mesh with each other in any meaningful way. They also removed the optional missions that would usually support and alter the main storyline missions that were in the previous games, and it's a little bit disappointing that they aren't here. Mission-wise, most levels are pretty straightforward. You get to make a base, and then you carry out an objective, which is usually kill the enemy. Or you have limited resources, and you have to complete a specific objective. I think my favorite of these was the Allied mission Sun Temple. In this mission, you are given Navy SEALs, and you free some of the local guerrilla forces, and then you go and systematically infiltrate and dismantle the Soviet base using your commandos and scant resources. This one just clicked for me in a way that made me feel like I was directing a late 80s military action movie. Anyways, these missions play out more like puzzles and give you a break from base management and focus more on recognizing and capitalizing on weaknesses in patrol paths and base setup. One shared weakness that every AI-made bases is that they keep leaving explosive fuel barrels like everywhere. I mentioned that Tiberian Sun had these kinds of missions too, but I didn't like that you never really had any units that were good at stealth or recon. Red Alert 2 addresses this issue by having dedicated infiltration units like spies, or for the Soviets you have Psi Commandos that literally let you yeet units over to your side like priests from Age of Empire. Wololo! I'd say on the general scale for pace of RTSs, Red Alert 2 is a little on the faster side. Units move faster, buildings and units die faster, and generally speaking, it doesn't take long to get into the action. The complexity of the missions are toned down a bit as well. You don't have missions like Capture Jake McNeil, where your target will move to a fortified location if you set off an alarm. But I do think some of the later levels can be a test of your macro and micro ability, since they have elements of wave survival. While I am a little sad that Red Alert 2 has toned down the mission scenario complexity, it does keep things moving at a nice clip that feels good for most people. Now, what is not disappointing is the sound and the music. Again, Frank Klepacki. I'm going to keep saying it until you believe it. The guy just nails it in every Command & Conquer, and Red Alert 2 is the most Rammstein and industrial of the entire series, with tracks like Grinder and Hell March 2. I am a simp for the bassline in the original Hell March, but I have to admit that Hell March 2 is just peak hype for destroying monuments with tanks. There's also a lot of funky tracks, but overall the tone is upbeat and aggressive and fits perfectly with the visuals. I don't think you're going to walk away from this game without humming the tunes that are living in your head rent-free. Sound design, again, they worked hard to differentiate every unit. In Red Alert, every unit either had a Russian accent or an American accent, but they pretty much said the same thing. Now, the GIs hoorah like they belong in a Schwarzenegger action flick, the terror drones tick sporadically as their spindly limbs move, and Harrier pilots have that distinct radioed calm voice. Aside from almost every unit having distinct lines, battle sounds are a symphony of destruction. Tesla coils build up to a lightning strike, Kira of airship bombs whistle on their descent, tanks even have the characteristic squeak and rumble of the engine revving, and the tracks passing over the wheels when they accelerate. It's good stuff, and it never feels cluttered or that it gets in the way of important information. Now, aside from the two campaigns, you have skirmish and multiplayer. Multiplayer will require the CNCnet patch to work, again, literally doing EA's job for them. The player base is a little bit bigger than Tiberian Sun, especially if you are playing the expansion. So here we are. Time is running out. Is Red Alert 2 a good game in 2023? Abso-freaking-lutely. 3D purists are going to have a seizure, but Red Alert 2 looks good. It sounds good. It plays well, and the story is a fun romp that lets you laugh at Americans, Russians, and the early 2000s in general, even if it lacks some of the depth and nuance of the Tiberium series. I think what Red Alert 2 brings to the table, more than anything, is just a wild imagination that makes you want to pencil out weird contraptions or attach lasers to animals that shouldn't be tamed. Now, if this isn't your thing, 1, what's wrong with you? But 2, this game is probably not for you. But I'd say that most people can enjoy what's here, even if you only take it at surface value. Gun to my head, and it's a Tesla coil, I give Red Alert 2 a 7.5 out of 10.